Let's finish up our discussion of the role of myth in the creation and resolution of conflict. So let's summarize the totality of Todorov's argument and relate that to myth. There were a variety of reasons for the Spanish conquest that were not all related to mythic conflicts. The Spanish indeed had better weapons and a better war machine. We talked about Montezuma's hesitancy due to the inevitability of the Toltec overthrow coming back around. But what we didn't talk about in presentation 2 was the fact that the Aztecs themselves were conquerors who conquered the people around them. So they weren't really a united civilization of dedicated warriors. Often in these instances, a disjunct dominated group will not really care who is dominating them and won't fight for the current authoritarian. So that was a factor. And Cortés knew all that because he had people who wanted to side with the dominant future leader. And so Cortés used interpreters and the signs of those interpreters who willingly interpreted them the right way so as to bring down Montezuma. Was it a miracle? This brings us to the idea of a metamyth, or let's say the myth about myths, the story about stories and storytelling. Let's reiterate that myths have such power as to not need any basis in fact or reality. If it is believed, people will act accordingly, even unto their own willing deaths in this case. That's the true power of myth. It's in the belief, the ability to evoke emotion and either freeze a person long enough to subdue them or make them frenzied so as to die for the cause. And that's indeed what happened. The belief that the Spaniards were the predicted return of the conquering Toltecs, Quetzalcoatl, made Montezuma hesitate, lose his speech, and his people did not fight. Put that together with a belief in the dominance of the one true God working miracles, where a handful of soldiers can dominate such a huge number of others, there were the reasons for the victory. Cortés used the signs and set the stage of belief and action. The Christian God was seen as egalitarian, according to Todorov, whereas the Aztec God was there to uphold the social order and the cyclical order of time. We see this in the Mayan book of creation, Popol Vuh. The gods created humans to count the days, to mark the time for planting and the seasons, but more importantly, to worship and praise them. If you lose your words of praise in that mythology, you are doomed. The outcome was written before it began to come about. Who wouldn't be at a loss for words? Cortés doesn't just manipulate the stories and give all the signs, but he also controls information to deceive the Aztecs. He makes all their predictions and fears come true. For the Aztecs, all human agency is annihilated by the cyclical mythic structure of their beliefs. It is known, as the Dothraki women in Game of Thrones say. Extending from Western history is the belief that all power comes from God. If you have power, you either are a god or you are the servant of a god. Why stand in the way of that power? You cannot stand up to God. You mess with the bull, you get the horns. History is filled with this divine appointment, and when not, the king appeals to the Pope for the appointment by proxy. And when that doesn't go well, the king appoints himself the Caesar, the Kaiser, the Tsar, the Pharaoh, or the Pope, or God himself. That's power, and the mythic stories reinforce the fact. So if myth is a form of narrative discourse communicating a message of understanding, then understanding the myths of others, as Cortés did, can influence how we interact with the others and manipulate them or help them. Your own stories as myths, carrying the truth and how you perceive the world to be, can blind you to the myths of others and hinder your ability to understand the other, just as in the cases of Columbus and Montezuma. So myths are signs and symbols that lead to action or inaction. When you understand the myths of others, you can predict their actions and can use the stories to motivate them. This is what Bruce Lincoln helps us understand. Let's consider my definition of myth now that we've seen how mythic conflict works. Myths are a form of discourse, signs and symbols communicating and making us interpret mysteries of life. We act and are motivated to act in predictable ways because of those myths. So knowing your own operant myths and the operant myths of others gives you power over your own people to helping or manipulating other people as well. So myths lead to action and organize a culture's experiences and the meaning of those experiences. Religions and the rituals of those practices come from myths and are an enactment of many of the myths. The commonly known myths are the hegemonic structure of the dominant class, which sometimes manifests itself in a state religion, with the king as the divinely appointed power of God's hand on earth. That is the medieval order of things to which you and I may be resubjected today with the authoritarians. Myths communicate to hinder or to influence the actions of a group of people. Be wise in your use of myths then. The next presentation will talk about a few things we've introduced here regarding Bruce Lincoln's assertion that myths are a form of narrative discourse.